Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very long overdue episode of the Gitcast podcast series. The podcast run by me, your most somewhat ambivalent host, Gitbag the Great. Now, I know I haven't done one of these in a while, but considering I haven't done a real proper gameplay video on this channel in a while, I thought this might be as good a thing as any to really kind of break that duck. And what I basically wanted to talk about in this episode, which I will be recording on my own, unfortunately, there's no guests this time, sadly, this week, but I do have a couple of interesting topics in regards to finding work and loot boxes in video games. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is loot boxes in video games and my personal feelings and ideas about them. Now, just for anyone who's new to these kind of videos on my channel, what I basically do in this podcast is talk about recent and topical issues that may then, if the conversation transforms into it, parlay into some other conversation about a similarly or somewhat relatively related topic. For example, I've had podcasts in the past where I've guest starred my friend Flash Suppressor, where we've then gone on to talk about, video games based around superheroes when we originally started talking about just comic books on themselves. So it's that kind of format. It's just kind of a free-flowing sort of discussion podcast based around a few topical and some semi-not topical questions and queries around each episode, because these are released usually a few weeks apart. But I'm going to try and make them a bit more regular in the future, like, say, at least once a week. But, in any case, let's get into it. And just so you know, the gameplay will just be in the background. It's just something to help me stimulate my brain and conversation. So if you don't fancy watching me play whatever I'm playing in the background, feel free to just have this podcast going on in the background. Now, on to the first topic of this episode of the Gitcast podcast, which is the issue of loot boxes in video games. Now, there's been a lot of sort of controversy recently surrounding the very possible and at this point looking quite likely inclusion of loot boxes and the like in the upcoming EA first-person shooter Battlefront 2, or as I like to call it, Star Wars Battlefront 4, because there were two Star Wars Battlefront games released on the PlayStation 2 that I personally prefer just a little bit more, but that's kind of besides the point, really. Now, people are kind of up in arms about this, at least some are, because of the fact that, well, the loot boxes are present in a game where it's already full price to pay for in the first place, and there is to some extent to which the gameplay is influenced by the presence of these loot boxes. And for me, I can understand this as being a very egregious thing for people to have present in a game they're playing, especially if it's one they want to play regularly. And I've heard this from people who played the first EA Star Wars Battlefront as well. And this isn't just a issue limited to, of course, Star Wars Battlefront 2, as in the one that's being released by EA in the next several months. It's actually one that's being shared by a few games that have come out in the last few years. One that comes to mind in particular being the last couple of Call of Duty games. Now, I can't quite remember from myself what installation in the Call of Duty that they started introducing loot box sort of additions to the online multiplayer gameplay, but I do remember there being some uproar when it was first introduced a few installations ago into the Call of Duty series, and I remember it getting particularly egregious and particularly complained about after 2014's instalment into the series, Advanced Warfare, which was probably the first step towards the Call of Duty series taking on this kind of space-age exosuit skeleton approach to gameplay, which it prevalently displayed for the next 4 or 3 installments, I believe. and you'll have to forgive my shadiness on that particular stat. I haven't really invested in the series since Black Ops 1, unfortunately, so the Call of Duty series really isn't my forte. But one thing I think that I personally found was particularly egregious and that turned me off the Call of Duty series thereafter a bit about the inclusion of loot boxes in that series was the fact that it did, to a certain degree, affect the gameplay, and perhaps not in the most balanced of manners. And not only this, you were also adding in, in the more recent installments, RPG elements into a generally skilled-based online multiplayer system, which, when you apply skill to RPG elements to loot box elements that directly affect the gameplay, you get quite a, just quite a sort of muddle of conflicting game theories and principles that realistically, in a practical sense, don't necessarily work alongside one another. And I think that's possibly a large, if not one of the main reasons why I personally haven't bought into the last few installments into the Call of Duty series. I may have a look at the World War II one when it comes out, if I have enough money when it does, or if it goes on discount at some point in the future, because it does actually look really good, like, say, a callback to the underrated glory that is Call of Duty World at War, which came out in 2008. But I do think there is some concern to be had in the way that some games do loot boxes in a similar fashion to how Call of Duty has been doing it for the last few installations in that series, in that, it's a fully priced game, and the loot boxes do include a fair few items that do directly affect the gameplay, and I personally feel that's not necessarily the best way of doing it, because on one hand you're giving people a clear chance to have an advantage over their opponents by buying into a game that's already full price, and also cutting out the middleman of grinding up to those particular items that they're wanting to get out of loot boxes without doing it the hard and, as some would say, honest and righteous way of doing it, by simply grinding up the ranks and levels. Now, there are probably cases, I would argue, where this is less egregious throughout gaming history in recent years, but the first one that came to my mind was Call of Duty, in particular its last 3 or 4 installments, so that's probably the biggest case of how I would say not to do loot boxes in video games. And possibly also, I would say, adding on to that, the recent controversy around this upcoming Star Wars Battlefront game. That, I would also say, is probably not the best way to add loot boxes, at the very least, into a full-priced game. Now, there are at least 2 main scenarios in which I have no problems with loot boxes, and I know that's quite a controversial thing to say, considering loot boxes have such a poisonous sort of ambience around them when you mention them in the space of even just low-priced discount sort of games. But hear me out on this. For me, there are at least 2 circumstances in which I have absolutely 100% no problems with loot boxes or buying into a game to get a better shift in it, whether it be cosmetic or in terms of gameplay. Now, the main way I have no problems of loot boxes being in full-priced games, like, say, for example, let's say Call of Duty, again, would be if, say, for example, the loot boxes just provided you with purely cosmetic items. Now, a game that's done this in a just fine enough manner, I believe, is Overwatch, which I play a fair bit myself, and I do enjoy it quite a lot. I bought it about 7 or 8 months after the game came out, so I was not around there for the initial burst of popularity it had right after it came out. But even before I started playing the game, I heard people complaining about the presence of loot boxes in a game that was already full priced. But what struck me as being particularly unusual is that the loot box rewards in Overwatch don't affect gameplay really in any way at all. There's kind of an ethos of, like, you feel like you can play a bit more comfortably if you have certain skin for the certain character that you really, really want, especially if it's a limited time skin revealed during one of the seasonal events, such as Halloween or Christmas, or the recent 1-year anniversary for Overwatch. But overall, I would say there's nothing inherently wrong, really, about the way in which the developers of Overwatch and the people who have released it, Blizzard, have gone around implementing loot boxes into their game, even though it is full priced. And this is primarily because, like I said, the game really only uses these loot boxes to dispense items to you that are purely cosmetic. There's no direct impact on the gameplay from these items that you get when you open these loot boxes. Now, you do have the option to pay real-world money to open these loot boxes if you are so inclined, but at the same time, I don't feel like the loot boxes in Overwatch are egregiously expensive, and even then you can earn still a fair amount of loot boxes for free just by leveling up or by participating in weekly arcade events and just earning them in a simple and honest way like that. But I don't feel like I would be particularly aggrieved by paying for them because, like I said, they're not particularly expensive and they don't impact the gameplay in any way. Now, I'm probably not going to buy into my own money to get loot boxes out of Overwatch until, well, I don't know when, unless I had, say, for example, the same profitability or size of audience as some of the really big Overwatch YouTubers out there, like Luselk or Zarbrad, or people like that. But realistically, I don't think there's any shame in them or anyone else spending any amount of money on loot boxes in Overwatch, just so long as they can afford it, because it's not going to affect their gameplay, it's not going to affect the affectability of which they might have with one particular hero against another person playing as any other hero. So why not let them just buy as many as they want, because realistically it's not going to impact them or anyone else's experience of the gameplay in any way. In fact, it may enhance it, because realistically the only way you're going to get any practical effect on the game out of the loot boxes in Overwatch is if you get a skin or spray or whatever that you really like, and that just makes you feel just a little bit more chilled out and relaxed. That might psychologically affect the way you play, but in reality, in practical terms, it doesn't directly affect the way you play, and so there's no real practical applications for saying that loot boxes in Overwatch shouldn't be there. Now, the way I would have no problems with loot boxes directly affecting gameplay in a game, especially if it's like a large scale one, would be, say, for example, if the game itself was free to play, like the game I'm playing in the background of this podcast here, World of Tanks. World of Tanks is a free to play game, and while people do have some issues with the microtransactions in the game and the way in which they're implemented and the way that sometimes they do in fact the gameplay, I would personally have to say, if there was a free-to-play game, regardless of what gender it was, or regardless of what genre it was, I should say, I would have no problem if there were paid loot boxes that directly affected the gameplay in a game that was free-to-play, just like, say, World of Tanks or War Thunder, or something like that, because they're already free-to-play games. You're not investing any money to begin with, so any money you invest is just extra profit to the developers and just kind of a bonus to them, really, and so I would have no problem with that. Now, some might see that as a bit of a dichotomy, because the way that, you know, you're getting into a game when it's free-to-play is to, you know, I guess, at least in terms of some sense of a principle for some, is to have an equal playing field to everyone, because you're all investing no money into it on the outset, so you're all going into it with the same expectations and the same basic level of competency, at least from the outset. Well, I shouldn't necessarily say competency, because online gaming is online gaming, and you're going to find fools really in any online game, so I guess I should probably be a bit more choice with my words there. But my point, I think, still stands. You really can't get too worked up, I think, about a free-to-play game including paid loot boxes that impact gameplay if it is free-to-play. Because you're not investing anything from the outset, so what have you got to lose if you're paying anything on top of that? Like, think about just the sheer amount of money you'd be spending. If, say, for example, you're paying for a full-price game, and then you spend some money on loot boxes or whatever that directly impacts the gameplay, then of course that is a bit of a shame, and you're already spending more than you were really expecting to pay for, and realistically we're expecting without having to buy any DLC or expansion packs. Whereas if you're buying a free-to-play game loot box or bit of microtransaction, then you're paying far less than you would be if, say, for example, you're paying for that on top of the price of a full-price game. Let's say you're paying for a full-price game for £50, and then you spend like 70, or let's say 20 to 30 pounds on microtransactions and loot boxes throughout the whole time you play that over the course of 1 to 2 years. Think about it, if you're playing a free-to-play game, all you're spending is 20 to 30 quid, whereas with the full price game you'd be spending 70 to 80 quid, when realistically all you might have originally wanted to play was just the original base price of 50 quid. Now, I'm granted saying this from my own personal perspective and how I personally feel about this, but like I said, what have you got to lose if you're paying money into a game where you haven't spent any money on it anyway to begin with? All you're doing is supporting a game that you've got an enjoyment out of, and that the developers haven't made any money from you just by you playing it. It's a very different situation, I feel, to an already fully priced game, because there you're already buying into it, you're already investing into it from the offset with a set amount of money that you set out to buy it with in the first place. Now, this doesn't mean you can't set out a certain amount of money to spend on a certain number of microtransactions and loot boxes in a game like World of Tanks, or say for example War Thunder, if we're going to use that example again, but at the same time there's no pressure on you to do so in order to impact the online multiplayer experience, because these games usually only have multiplayer, and there's no base price to play anyway because they're already free to play games in the first place. And not only that, but it's like usually it can be encouraged for at least pro players to pay into games like these in order to improve their own experience on the pro circuit, and I can certainly respect and understand that, and I think that's fine really. I don't personally have any problem with that necessarily myself. I mean, I think it's a little bit egregious in games like, say, FIFA or Call of Duty, where there are professional scenes, but they're already, you know, randomised packs and the like that do directly impact gameplay, but I would have no problems with a pro player in something like World of Tanks or LoL spending as much money as they want to, because it's really their prerogative and it's already a free to play game anyway, so who am I to say what they can and can't do with their money? I guess it's kind of a said and done issue with how I've explained it, at least from my perspective, but I feel like the way that people talk about loot boxes in video games can sometimes get a bit overly vociferous, particularly when it is in regards to cheap or free-to-play games. Now, that being said, even in free-to-play games, I would still advise against putting loot boxes in the game that directly impacts gameplay, and I would say that is probably the best thing to avoid really in any game, but ultimately I don't have any problem with that happening in a free-to-play game, and like I've said earlier, I don't have any problems with cosmetic loot boxes in full-price games, because it's not directly impacting their gameplay, and it's entirely up to the person in regards to how much money they put in. I think there has also got to be an element of self-control in regards to how much we invest in things like microtransactions and free-to-play loot boxes and stuff like that. You know, in large part it is down to us. Yes, the developers do have a sense of responsibility as well if it is impacting almost entirely, if not mostly, on the way that we play the game and how much experience and credits and the like we may earn out of a game by investing into it. You know, I don't think that microtransactions, even in a free-to-play game, should be the supplement and the main way of progressing your experience and credits earning and general enjoyment and progression through the game. But I do think it should be a supplement if the developers do want it to be, just not the sole or main one. You know, I do think there should be some natural progression that should be the main enticement of the game, because if you're just paying your way through the game, then really there's nothing left to enjoy. So while I do realistically have no problems with paid loot boxes and packs and stuff like that in a free-to-play games that directly impact the gameplay, at the same time I don't think there should be the sole or main aspect of progressing through the game and progressing your own rank, credits, XP, whatever, because then realistically what have you got to play for? You should primarily be progressing through your own steam and your own skill, and just using these microtransactions as kind of a supplement. Now, Wargaming, I would say, have sometimes slipped up in this regard, and they, you know, do still make mistakes sometimes, even after World of Tanks have been out for quite some time. But it's a free-to-play game, and, you know, there's always tweaks and dinks and little bits and bobs to work out now and again whenever they introduce something new, because it is a massive game, and it's been out since, well, it's been in development realistically since 2009, and then it was released into the public in 2010 and 11 in different circumstances. So it is essentially a work in progress, I guess you could say. So I guess in that regard, I should say there is, you know, a level of responsibility that developers of these kind of games, as well as full price games, do have to accept and undertake. But at the same time, there has got to be a level of self-restraint that people who invest money while playing the games, like whether it be Overwatch or World of Tanks, have to have in themselves. And I think that is really critical to the way that we progress through games like that, as well as just our general enjoyment out of them. Because if you're just progressing through a game entirely by putting your money into it, then why did you invest in that game in the first place? I guess I could say that this is perhaps a little bit contradictory to the autonomy and the respect of the average gamer throughout gaming, but, well, you can't be entirely replicant of blame onto the heads of the developers, because they're not the ones who are controlling your personal funds and your personal disposition on how you spend those funds on their game. So overall, I think there's no problem with loot boxes in an inherent way if they directly impact the gameplay in free-to-play games. I do think they should be purely cosmetic if it's in a fully priced game. And thirdly, I also think there's got to be a small, at the very least, extent of self-constraint and self-discipline from gamers when we're spending money on these kind of games in regards to these microtransactions and loot boxes. And if you are so inclined, if you do see a game that has microtransactions and loot boxes in a way, or at least implemented in a way into that said game that you really, really, really just cannot abide by and completely disagree with, then just don't support it. I mean, vote with your wallet and just don't support the games that you disagree with on both a qualitative and moral sense. It's really as simple as that. And I know that probably sounds a bit high and mighty, and I apologise for that, but realistically and practically, I would say that's the way of things to go in this modern game industry. You know, the game industry has always been a developing different beast from era to era, and so when you get a new issue that rises up with each different generation of video games, you have to tackle it not just in a theoretical way, but at least at the time you have to tackle it in a practical and realistic way, unfortunately. And that does mean sometimes being brutally honest and looking at ourselves and how we conduct ourselves in terms of spending our money. You know, if you don't want to support a game that has loot boxes and transactions in it, that you disagree with in the way that they are implemented or how much they impact the game, then just don't support it. It's entirely up to you. I guess that's kind of really all I have to say on the issue. I guess I probably rambled a bit at a couple of points there, and I do apologise about that, but it's just something that's been coming up a lot recently in regards to the possibility of loot boxes being in Call of Duty World War II and the surety that they'll be in Star Wars Battlefront 2. I would personally really advise against EA putting them in Battlefront 2, but they're EA. They're probably not going to listen to some YouTuber who only has just about 3 dozen subscribers, so we'll just see what happens. I wonder if actually a lot of people will invest into the game or just simply not buy it because of that, and that is a possibility. But then again, Star Wars is such a big franchise, and EA are such a big company with such a wide reach of influence and popularity that chances are they'll still make just enough profit to bank on that anyway, and possibly even make another sequel. So we'll just have to see, I'm afraid. I will just have to see. It's a brutal business, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles, unfortunately, in this modern games industry, and some of us like it, some of us do, some of us don't. So we'll just have to wait and see how it goes, I think, realistically. I do think, we do have to proportionally look at it with each individual issue, because in some cases these kind of things are a bit more egregious than in others, in some cases they're not, so you can't always approach it with the same attitude that loot boxes and microtransactions in games are just verbatim, by note of just being what they are, wrong. They're not always necessarily wrong. It depends on how egregious they are, how much they cost, what kind of the game they are placed in, how much that costs, whether it's free to play or not, and whether they directly impact the gameplay. There's many, many, many factors that impact this in a significant manner. So I really think you can't just bang out a 5 to 20 minute reaction video on a game like, say, for example, EA Star Wars Battlefront 2, including these sort of things, and just call it a day at that. You have to really think about it, really think about the context, really think about the price of the game, really think about the reward that the loot boxes or microtransactions will be giving you, how they affect the gameplay, how much they'll cost, and also possibly the inclusion of season passes and stuff like that. And, granted, I'm saying this after having said the way that I think they're doing it, or that they're proposing to do it in EA Star Wars Battlefront 2 is wrong, but my point still stands. You have to look at each individual case, step by step, in a proportional and contextual manner, because you can't just take a broad approach to every single instance of something like this happening and expect that to be the end of the case. So really, really have to think about it long and hard, I think, in order to get a proper picture of whether or not you definitely want to support a game like either Overwatch or EA's Battlefront 2 or the next Call of Duty game, or whatever, really, or even a free-to-play game that includes loot boxes. I should point out, anyway, just before I go on, to people who haven't played World of Tanks before, because I know I mentioned it in passing throughout this discussion, but World of Tanks does not currently have loot boxes in it. I should just mention that. It does have microtransactions, and, I know many people who don't mind investing into the microtransactions in World of Tanks, but it does not currently have loot boxes. Microtransactions and loot boxes are considerably different things in different circumstances, so I just wanted to put that out there for people who are reviewing this series, or at least this video in particular, and have never heard of World of Tanks, or at the very least just unfamiliar with it. Now, the next topic of discussion I wanted to go into, and I know this is a bit of a jarring segue, but unfortunately I don't have a guest this time, so it's a little bit tricky to find a segue to parlay off of and bounce gently into the next conversation, so you'll just unfortunately have to bear with me in this instance, is the issue of finding work in your personal life and how you can learn to sort of earn money from this. And I guess this kind of ties a little bit into buying into loot boxes and microtransactions. Because if you have a job where you regularly earn a healthy amount of money and you've got enough spared over from after you've, paid off like rent, council tax, bills, utility bills, and food and drink and travel and all that stuff, and you want to spend on microtransactions and loot boxes in your favourite video games, then I think everyone has every right to do that. And it's, really down to the person who's using their credit card to do that. Like I said earlier, you need to really vote with your wallet on these kind of issues. But you can only realistically do that if you are earning regular amounts of money in a significant, at least enough way, from a regular enough job. And one thing I've realised in recent times, as I've started my first year of my 2-year MA at the University of Sussex, while searching for at least part-time work to help me sort of supplement the costs of living in Brighton and studying at the University of Sussex, is that searching for work is damn hard. Especially when you're a student who hasn't necessarily got the same amount of experience as, let's say, for example, someone in their 30s who's been in a certain industry for, say, 5 to 10 years or something like that. Because many of the people who I've gone up against when I've tried to apply for a job, more qualified or more, shall we say, intellectually intensive than, say, kitchen portering, which I've done a lot of in the past, is that these will in often cases be jobs where you will have required to have had at least, say, a year or two of experience in that particular sector or industry. And I'm talking about, jobs such as administration or finance or secretary work. And this is entirely fair enough, because these kind of jobs do, in lots of cases, depending on which industries they're parlayed off of, require a fair extent of intellectual and relevant experience. And so having a lot of experience in a sector like kitchen portering, like I have, is helpful, but at the same time you're also going to need a lot of studitious knowledge and perhaps also volunteering knowledge if you have your set mind on a particular industry that you want to go into, whether it be finance or stuff like that. Particularly to do actually with high level jobs like finance or banking or stuff like that, because those kind of jobs can be fairly high earning depending on which sector or company you're doing it for and how long you end up doing it for with whichever company. Granted, that is taking into account the fact that some companies pay more than others, depending on different jobs, and sometimes on same jobs just in different sectors or industries, but that's kind of up to each individual company, dependent of course on the minimum wage for each age group in said certain country where that company is basing their offices out of. But the main thing I've realised though, since trying to look for work while starting my MA, is that you can't just sort of set your sights on one particular work area. When you're a student, there's a lot of costs that you might not necessarily see for or foresee at first while you're doing your course, whether it's an MA or an undergraduate degree or even a PhD. So I would have to say, broaden your horizons and apply for a number of jobs where you think you'd at the very least be competent at, and be able to at the very least display a satisfactory level of ability to achieve that job, or at least do it on a semi-regular basis. And there's two steps to this. One, you have to read each job description when you're applying for it very carefully and think about what your own personal skills are and be very brutally honest with yourself. And also think about the schedule that you've got with your studies and how that can fit into the job you're looking for. I mean, me myself, I'm trying to look for part-time work at the moment because, like I said, I'm studying an MA for the next couple of years. And so in doing that, there are a lot of part-time jobs where I think I would just be fine for that, or at least at the very least I would be able to do it in a satisfactory manner. But at the same time, I've also realised there's a lot of jobs in sectors where I would be interested in going into, but that ultimately I have to realise that I probably wouldn't be satisfactory, or at the very least competent enough in those particular sectors to fully achieve the aim that those employers would necessarily want of me. And so I have to be brutally honest with myself sometimes and say, right, well, as much as I'd like to do that job, that realistically probably isn't going to be the case for me. Now, sometimes I might apply for these kind of jobs just in case, and just because I do really, really, really like the look of a particular job in that area, and also because I think I could learn a lot about that topic from at least trying to apply for that job. But if you're wanting to go into a particular area, again, let's just say receptionist work or financial work, and you have very little to no experience in it, then I would say your best bet is to do either some side studying at the very least on that particular topic, and also perhaps supplement that by doing some unpaid apprenticeships and volunteering in that particular area. Now, me in particular, I have my eye on a few job areas I would like to go into, and I'm trying to look for, on top of part-time work to help support myself in the here and now while I study, I'm also trying to look for either apprenticeships or volunteering while I'm studying in order to help build up my experience even further than it already is in regards to the few work areas that I'm particularly interested in going into after I finish my studies. And I would recommend doing this even if you're not going to earn any money from it, like say if it's an unpaid internship or if it's just straight up volunteering, because the more experience and knowledge you get on your CV, or that you just have personally yourself, the more impressed interviewers will be and employers will be when they see that your CV or your resume or your application form or wherever it may be shows that you do have at least general volunteering experience, or experience in a very general sense, or at the very least, or preferably I should say, experience and volunteering and knowledge of their particular industry and subject area that their business and their role that they're advertising for you to apply for is based in. Now granted, some sectors and some jobs may be more intensive for this kind of thing. I've seen some certain jobs in the past that you must have at least only about 2 to 6 months experience in this particular job area or this general industry to apply for yada yada this kind of job. But for the most part, I've seen jobs that have that kind of criterion apply for them with the necessity or the requirement of you having at least a year of experience in whatever job area they're advertising that job as being in. There have also been quite a few I've seen in the past that have 2 years requirement, and some even 3 or 4 years. So you have to really build up your experience over time, I'd say, while you're younger or while you're in university, in order to get a job that you really, really, really want. Now, granted, this isn't always the case, and you can sometimes be lucky or find a job that is fairly high demanding, but not necessarily as high maintenance as some might say. So sometimes it may not be as much of an imperative to have said experience for that job area, depending of course on what you're applying on and what you're applying for and which company this is and which industry and work area this particular job is in. But I do think it still pays anyway, even if it's not an entirely necessary requirement of the job that you're applying for, because it will still look good even if it's not a necessary requirement. And I guess the final thing I've got to say about applying for work, especially while you're at university, is you've just got to keep doing it. And you've also got to apply for a lot as well, because I heard on the radio recently, and I can't remember which show it was or which industry it was about, but sometimes employers will have hundreds of applications for just a single vacancy. So you've got to realistically just keep going at it, keep trying, keep going, keep going. I mean, me myself, while I've been applying for jobs, it hasn't been easy, and I have gotten pretty down sometimes because of the sheer number of job applications I've sent out and how demoralising it gets sometimes when you send out a number of job applications and sometimes you may not even get a reply back. That is just what sometimes happens. Not always, and sometimes not even most of the time, but It does sometimes, some of the time, happen. But regardless of that, you've just got to bite the bullet and just say, alright, well, maybe I wasn't as successful with that one. What did I perhaps not do as well about that one? Alright, let's try and look at this in a positive way. How can I apply that to how I can improve my applications and CVs for job applications or volunteering or whatever in the future? So it's kind of a really long process of just applying for loads and loads and loads of jobs and apprenticeships and the like, and every time you fail at one, if you do fail at a number of these applications, try and think, right, what did I do? What did they ask for? What was their criterion? What did I think I did wrong? Should I maybe have gotten someone to proofread it? And then use that all to collate together to try and improve for the next job application you might make in regards to a similar company or a similar job in a similar work area and industry. You can also use that to apply yourself to general job applications as well. So it might help you, if not in that particular job area that you're applying for, at least in a general sense in applying for work and stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, the main point is it's just a very, 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 very long process of trial and error. Unfortunately, that is the case. While you're unqualified and, or at least low-skilled in your younger years and while you're studying at uni, you may very well, a lot of the time, have to take up jobs that you might not necessarily like, or volunteering opportunities that you might not have necessarily foreseen yourself doing beforehand, in order to build up your experience, or at the very least just have a better chance of earning a bit of money in the short term while you're at university. I know this doesn't necessarily sound the most attractive prospect, and I'm fully aware of that, don't get me wrong, but it is just the way life is, I've realised myself, and so, well, that's just the way, again, to use this term again, twice in the same blooming episode of this podcast, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, realistically. I mean, there's no other real nice sugar-coated way of putting it, and realistically, there's no real way of sugar-coating it, period, because that is just the way the world goes. You just got to keep on trying, keep on learning from your mistakes, and keep on applying that to your experiences and your attempts at whatever you're trying to work towards in the future. And I guess I could say that about not just work and applying for work, but also studies and just general life experience. Because we all experience mistakes and peaks and valleys in life in general, not just in regards to work. So it is kind of a series of trial and error in all aspects of life and not just in regards to work. So it's a good principle, I think, to apply to life in general. Not just work, not just deciding on whether or not you want to spend money on microtransactions in video games, and in regards to a number of other things in life as a whole, and in also specific areas, I guess, as well. Anyway, I think that'll do it for this episode of the Gitcast podcast. I've kind of wrapped up all the topics I really had to mind that I wanted to really talk about in this episode. Again, I apologise about the somewhat, I guess you could say, one-sided tone of this episode, as it is unfortunately just me without any guest this time, unlike the last several episodes of the Gitcast podcast series, but apologies and salutations to anyone who's decided to listen in to this episode this far. But I'll try and replicate that in the future, and if not, then I'll just try and do these episodes as well as I can. But they're pretty rudimentary videos, and that's really kind of the main aim of these kind of videos, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. They are just general discussion sort of videos, and that's kind of why I just enjoy making them. I just do enjoy talking generally about these kind of topics, and just whatever else comes to mind, even if it's something mundane about, like, comic book lore, or something quite important and relevant, like job experience and the hardships of applying for work. So, take that as you may. You know, I did kind of explain the format of these podcasts that I do at the beginning of this episode. And like I said at the beginning of this episode, I will try to make this, at the very least, a weekly series, because I want to do at least one of these a week, just so I can get a chance to, like, get out some of the ideas that I've been thinking about in the previous week, or just generally just chat and just waffle for a bit. You know, it's sometimes nice to do that. Not all the time, and not too much, granted, because sometimes it can get on people's nerves, but you get my point, or at least hopefully you guys do. In any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of the Gitcast podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for whatever I may be talking about next time, as is the usual case with these. And if you did like this video, be sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. And if you want to show any extra support to me, be sure to check out my 2 other YouTube channels in the video description below, as well as my social media platforms, as well in the video description below. And until next time, I've been Gitbag the Great. I'll see you guys next time. Have fun, stay safe, don't do anything I wouldn't do, and I'll see you guys on the battlefield. Bye bye for now.